Um, this was supposed to be a live in-person event, and we would have had books for sale, courtesy of the bookstore in Lenox. So I will pop a link in the chat for those of you who would like to order a copy of Marilyn's book. Matt Tannenbaum at the bookstore in Lenox does have them in stock, and we love to support our local Lenox businesses. So tonight I am going to introduce the person who will introduce Marilyn to you. Rachel Urquhart is here joining us. Though she was born and raised in Manhattan, Rachel spent summers and weekends on her family's dairy farm in Tyringham, where she now lives full-time. She has been a writer and editor her entire adult life, with long stints at Spy and Vogue, and many years freelancing at a variety of publications, including The New Yorker, The New York Times, Tin House, Elle, Harper's Bazaar, Food and Wine, Travel and Leisure, Vanity Fair, Women's Times, and The Reader. And she has written one novel, The Visionist, in 2014, published by Little Brown and Company, and 3 lifestyle books for Knopf's Chic Simple series. She currently runs a writing workshop and works as an editor and writing coach for both adults and teens. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Rachel to introduce tonight's author.
Thank you, Katie. It's such an honor to be here. It's such an honor to be introducing Marilyn, who I have a feeling needs no introduction to many of you. But I thought that I might talk about something that some of you might not know about her, which is our background together really began as teacher and student. And about 4 or 5 years ago, Marilyn had studied with the amazing Michelle Gillette, and had been working with Nina Ryan as well on the book that she'll be reading from tonight. I came in as a pair of sort of fresh eyes on the project, and I felt so honored to, I don't know, just to be working with someone who embodies like everything that I think a real writer needs to have, which is to say, Marilyn is incredibly brave. This is a brave story. It's a hard story. And she just wasn't going to let it go until she had it the way she wanted it. And she had incredible discipline throughout the many years that she worked on this. And I can relate to spending many years writing a book, since it took me 10 years to write mine. She had a kind of perseverance that is just critical to being a real writer, and a lack of ego, which isn't to say that, she didn't know exactly what she wanted, but I think being able to step out of your way and kind of see things from another perspective is a very helpful thing when you're writing. And I think there was a willingness to just go back in and revise and revise and revise. And that's also critical to being a real writer. So I guess I just want to say that I think this is really an extraordinary book. And I watched it go from already really full and amazing and a great story and beautifully told, to something that is sharp and concise and very, very moving. It was always moving, but to sort of work with Marilyn on kind of paring down and paring down and paring down was really what I did. I think it's great, and if you haven't read it, I hope you all will, because it's beautiful and true, which is the other thing. Marilyn is a truth teller, and this is a very truthful book. So, Marilyn, I'm going to give the floor to you, since you're the person everyone's here to see. But
thank you very much, Rachel. And obviously, Rachel has been a very influential and wonderful teacher in my life, in my writing life. I want to thank Rachel for the introduction, and I want to thank Katie and the Lenox Library for hosting this event. Rachel already mentioned Nina Ryan. I also want to give a shout out to Alexis Hurley, my agent, who championed this book. I will mention my website in case I forget to mention it later. If you want to read anything more about me and my book, it's marilynpetersonhouse.com. In one word, Marilyn Peterson House. I'm going to actually, since this is a book reading, it would have been in person. I'm actually going to read the first chapter. Don't worry, it's only a little bit over 9 minutes long, and we'll have time to talk about the 3 themes that are kind of identified or are emerged from this first chapter. I drop you into a scene that is following a very chaotic scene. The admitting nurse thought I was an idiot. I could see it in her eyes. "What took you so long?" she asked, peering over the top of her reading glasses. "We've been waiting. It's been hours since you called." Sharon sank into her gold corduroy jacket. My hands trembled in my lap. What took so long? If the nurse had seen me shaking outside Mom's condominium on the frigid Minnesota morning, if she had heard the officer shouting, "Try to make it easy for him," and what does he do? Fights like a bull, has to trash the place. If she had seen the officer spraying spit in my face as he ranted, kicks his way down the hallway, shatters the glass door with his stocking feet. If she had heard me pleading with the officer to bring my brother to the emergency room, she wouldn't have looked at me the way she did. "It took 6 attendants to get him on the gurney," she said, leveling her gaze at me. "The first set of shots didn't touch him, had to give him a second round to bring him down." I had no idea my twin was so strong. He had never gotten into fights, at least none that I knew about. My knuckles had turned a bloodless yellow. I unclenched my hands and wiggled my fingers while the nurse moved her pen down the admitting form. Sharon shoved her permed ash blonde hair away from her glasses, left me to do all the talking about her husband. "He's 45 years old," the nurse said, noting the date, October 29, 1941, when we were born. "It's highly unusual that he's never been hospitalized. The first manic episode normally occurs in the early 20s. She stared at my stunned face. I stared back. "Are there any people in your family who are manic depressive?" she asked. "No, everyone in our family is fine." She set the clipboard down and removed her glasses. "This type of mental illness is very difficult to diagnose. If there's any history, any people in your family, maybe an aunt or an uncle, information like that could help us determine what's going on with your brother." The nurse watched me as I opened and closed my hands, rubbed my knuckles. I wanted to tell her how Dr. Dowswell had never heard a second heartbeat, how Mom had said, "I told you so," after she gave birth to my twin, how Dad's face had broken into a proud grin as in the picture she took with her brownie box camera, one baby on each knee, Marilyn and Marvin, a girl, and finally, after waiting so many years, the boy he had wanted. But the nurse wouldn't care about any of that. "I remember one time when Marvin seemed nervous," I said. "What do you mean by nervous?" she asked, squinting at me through her glasses. "Nothing, just that he seemed tense." I wanted to stop talking, but she kept staring at me. "He was on leave from Germany and came to visit George and me. We were living in Connecticut. We'd only been married a couple of months." I remembered how his eyes had flashed with anger, his pale face turning a deep red as he pounded the table while arguing with the long distance operator. It wasn't like him, I told the nurse, talking to the operator like that. "Go on," she said, as she scrawled notes on the form. Years later, Mom had told me about the rest of his leave, which he spent with them, how Pastor Folden had driven to their farm to tell her he thought Marvin should see a doctor. I asked her what caused Pastor Folden to make such a shocking suggestion. "Well, anyone could see Marvin was nervous," Mom said, swatting her curly red hair away from her face. "I told Elsie what the minister said. She said Pastor Folden should be taken out and shot." I never dared to bring up the subject again. I didn't bring it up with the nurse. She would have made too much of it. I did tell her about the scar on his arm, how it had always bothered me. One time I asked him about the thick, jagged mark. He said, "I got it in the military." I asked if he'd been in a fight, but he clammed right up. I knew better than to ask again. "That's all I can think of," I said to the nurse. She turned to Sharon. Anything come to mind? No, I can't think of anything. Sharon didn't mention the night 6 years earlier when they were at the farm for Dad's funeral. The rest of us had hovered over him in his hospital bed, but Marvin sat at the side of the room, not saying anything as our father lay dying. After the burial, I heard him cry out in the middle of the night. Sharon was sleeping beside him. She had to have heard the anguish in his voice as it echoed through the silent house. I never told anyone about it, except my husband, George. He had slept right through it. How about depression, the nurse asked, tapping her pen on the clipboard. Any signs of depression in your family? The back of the chair was digging into my spine. I shifted my position before responding. I remember once when Dad had what I suppose could be called a bout of depression. It was at the time George and I got married. I had been annoyed at his griping about having to wear a tuxedo instead of his good enough gray Sunday suit, and his grumbling about my having someone from Augsburg College play Handel and Mendelssohn when our church organist could play some perfectly fine gospel hymns. Just ignore him, Mom said. He'll get over it. But it was hard to ignore my father when I had wanted him to enjoy the most important day in my life. It was perfectly understandable, I told the nurse. Marvin had volunteered for the Army, and Dad was upset because that meant he didn't want to take over the family farm. And not only that, Dad's mother had died a couple of months before our wedding, so he had a lot on his mind. Go on, the nurse said, her pen scribbling across the clipboard. He told me he couldn't get to sleep at night. When I asked what was keeping him awake, he said he could hear his heart beating. I thought that was a strange reason for not being able to sleep. He ended up going to the doctor. Farmers never go to the doctor. He got some pills, sleeping pills, I think. What else? The nurse asked. It was all for good reason. He did have a habit of worrying about the crops, but farmers always worry about the crops. And anyway, nothing ever kept him from getting his work done. She clamped another sheet of paper onto her clipboard. I could be wrong about all of this, I said. If you asked anyone else in our family, they'd say I was making it up. There had been times when I was afraid to talk to Dad. Instead of being excited about a vacation, he was silent while lugging the milk machine from cow to cow. Sometimes after we finished supper, he'd stand on the porch saying nothing as he stared off into the distance. His silences only lasted a week or two, but I had feared they'd go on forever. I didn't tell the nurse about his silences. She'd turn it into more than it was. What else? She asked. I thought about Marvin's tics and shrugs while we were growing up, the way Mom had to practically drag him out of bed so he'd be ready in time to catch the bus. The times he moped around the house, lying across his bed when Dad wanted him to help with the work. No need to mention any of that. Lots of teenage boys behave that way. I can't think of anything more, I said. Mom never gets depressed. She likes to complain if someone does something she doesn't like. She can go on for days, sometimes weeks, when she gets herself going. How about signs of depression with your relatives? Any aunts or uncles, cousins? Hard to tell. I massaged a muscle that had tightened up in the back of my neck. There could be some depression. I can't know for sure. Swedes don't like to admit to anything being wrong. A manic Swede should be pretty easy to notice. Why was I making a stupid joke when my brother was in the emergency room, strapped down on a gurney, shot up with 2 rounds of God knows what? Maybe the nurse thought I was manic, running my mouth, shifting in my chair. Sometimes I wondered if I talked too much, especially around my relatives, filling in the gaps in the conversation as they sat, poker-faced, considering whether there was something they might like to say. At times, I had a lot of energy, maybe too much energy. The nurse reached for the phone on the corner of her desk and punched 4 buttons. He's been moved to a room, she said, as she dropped the receiver back into a cradle. Would you like to see him? Yes, I would like that, Sharon said. She reached down and picked up her purse and mittens. Going to see my brother would have been the right thing to do, to try to explain why I had called the police, to reassure him that everything was going to be okay. But instead of going to face him, I hunched down in a chair and waited in the lobby. What had gone wrong? What had happened to my brother? So that's the first chapter. And in there, I sort of introduced some of the themes that I'm going to talk about now. The 3 themes, the first one is the unique connection between twins. And the second one will be the cruel consequences of mental illness. And the third one will be my quest for independence. And of course, you can type your questions into the chat box. So twins, people have always been fascinated by twins. Twins appear in mythologies around the world. For example, the Roman and Greek twins, Apollo and Artemis, and Castor and Pollux. And in the Old Testament, you have Jacob and Esau, which are the twins I draw some parallels with in my book. Some cultures believe that one twin was conceived by either a spirit, either divine or evil, the other by a mortal human being, meaning one twin was either a good twin and the other an evil twin. In some cultures, one twin might be abandoned to the elements, or one might be buried in a clay pot, alive in a clay pot. Marvin, my twin Marvin, and I knew nothing about these mythological twins. Having a twin for me meant having a constant companion throughout my childhood, and forming intense bonds with him from the time we crowded against each other in a uterus meant for one. These bonds were accentuated by our growing up in the isolation of a farm 120 miles west of Minneapolis and 7 miles from the nearest town of 700 inhabitants. When I tell what seems to be a pastoral tale as my twin and I explore the woods behind the machine shed, as we hunt for new litters of kittens in the haymow, as we ride in the two-wheeled wagon with Dad when he goes to fetch a calf in the far end of the pasture, I'm also setting up the themes that I'll return to later in the book, albeit from a vastly different understanding. I also immerse you into what it was like to grow up in on a Minnesota farm in the 40s and 50s. And while I do so, I describe the strict religious beliefs of our family. We were members of the fundamentalist evangelical religion, which at that time was very rigid. And I took in the black and white view of the world. If you were a born again Christian, you would spend eternity in heaven. If you were not, you were doomed to spend eternity in the fires of hell. I took all this in. My mother was a very devout person in the faith. I didn't question any of the strictures until Marvin and I were teenagers. And we were not allowed to play cards. We were not allowed to go to movies. We're not allowed to go to dances. I was not allowed to knit on Sunday because knitting was considered to be work, and you were not allowed to work on Sunday. That might have made some sense when my grandmother knit clothes because she would have to run down the sheep to start with. Another religious and cultural belief that had a huge impact on my twin and me was my parents' strong ideas about the rights, the authority, and the responsibilities of the firstborn son, which was the role intended for my twin. He was the one who was to be the leader. He was the one who was to work with my father and take over the farm, make my father proud. But Marvin had no interest in farming. My mother took up the role of trying to make my twin into the son my father wanted. And so any of my accomplishments that she thought would diminish my twin, she tried to squash me down to make my twin look good. So I was stunned when I read in the baby books she had written for us when I was a few decades ago when they resurfaced, and she had written that I had been able to walk across a room at 11 months by myself, and that she kept me in the walker for 3 months so I wouldn't walk before my twin. When I asked her about that, I said, why did you do that? And she said, well, I guess you waited for Marvin. Those efforts on her part to hold me back continued throughout her years, to hold me back relative to my twin. Another factor that molded us on the farm was our Scandinavian stoicism. Our great-grandparent immigrants came from Sweden, one from Norway. And an example of this is my mother's father, Hjalmar Jansson in Sweden, Hjalmar Jansson in the United States. Hjalmar had a young brother who died before he was born. When Hjalmar was 5, a 3-year-old brother died. When he was 7, his mother died. And a few months later, an infant sister died. His father remarried and they immigrated to Minnesota. They had a daughter, and then he was killed in a horse accident before the second daughter was born. Both of those daughters, Jalmar's half-sisters, died as teenagers. I asked my mother about all these deaths because I had known nothing of them. She knew little about them. I asked her, didn't your dad talk about them? And she said he never spoke of it. Our immigrant great parents were also shaped by the beauty and the brutality of the frontier. Plagues of locusts would devastate their crops, would eat anything that was green, including the leaves on the trees. Prairie fires would blaze through the fields and incinerate everything in their path. Diphtheria killed many of the children in our church, our family church, a family with 8 children. 7 of them died within a couple of weeks of diphtheria. Psychologists say that trauma that the immigrants experienced is transmitted down through several generations. So their hardships also shaped the world that Marvin and I inhabited. My intense bonds with my twin did not begin to fray until we finished 6th grade in the one-room country school and rode the bus to the town school. By the time that was when my brother's tics and shrugs began to emerge, and when my mother began to try to get him to be the son my father wanted. It was when by the time we were in high school, our relationship had deteriorated into contentious squabbles. I couldn't bear his lethargy and his constant complaining, and he told me that I would drive any man to drinking. Our isolation on the farm led me to believe that life was going on somewhere else and I was missing it. I couldn't wait to escape. Now I'm going to show you some pictures from that time, if I'm able to do a share screen. Okay, this is the cover of my book, and it shows us as 7-month-old twins. It was, of course, the tear was put in by the art department and the Post Hill Press. This is my mother when we were probably about 2 months old and standing in front of our farmhouse. You can't see her red hair on this picture. Here's my dad a few months later, where he's holding us on both his knees. Here's my sister Betty, 4 years older than us. Between us, I've been the one on the right on all these pictures, but I think 2 things you might find interesting. One is the clothesline full of cloth diapers, which you can imagine there were many of them. And my sister is covered with dirt and mud, which Marvin and I would also have been had we been able to walk. Here's my dad giving us an exciting adventure to sit in a wagon box. Here we are standing in front of our farmhouse, probably about 3 years old, I'm guessing, probably also getting ready to go to church. And this is our 38 Chevy that we rode in. Again, we're a little older here. This is, I believe, our 5th birthday. Mother made these sailor suits from the wave uniform of one of Dad's sisters who had returned from the war. This is as we're getting a little older, my mother sewed our matching clothes, as you can probably tell, and many of our other clothes were hand-me-downs. This is the one-room school on the left that we went to. The school that was built in 1900. The school on the right was built in 1879, which is about the same time mansions were being built in Lenox. This is the 1st grade in that one-room school, and I'm in the 4th from the left. Marvin is the 2nd from the left. And we were a very large grade because there were only 20 kids in 8 grades in that school, and we were 6 of them. This is us in 6th grade, our last year in that school. This shows you a little bit more what we actually looked like. I'm in the middle of the back, Marvin's on the far right. This is the town where we went to town school, Kirkhoven, population 700 then, population 700 now. This is an older picture, but the town retains much of the same character. So this is 8th grade. Marvin had slicked back his hair. This is 7th grade. I had borrowed my mom's necklace. I thought that was going to look really good. Here's our farmhouse that I took. My dad got a 35mm camera. I climbed up on the barn roof and took the picture of the house from the side. And these are the farm buildings. You see the windmill, and then on the right is the machine shed and the garage, and then the granary, and down on the far right is the hen house. This is another view of the barn in the winter with the silo, and you see the big house down below. Here we are on graduation from high school. This is me when I returned from a trip to Europe during my, right between my sophomore and junior year in college. And here is Marvin home on a leave from the military. So I'm going to stop that share right now, and I'm back. So the second theme I want to talk about is mental illness and the effect on our family and how we coped and didn't cope with it. Many, if not all, most of us have someone in our family who has a mental illness. When Marvin was a teenager, I think he was indeed suffering from depression, but we didn't understand that. We didn't know that, probably due to our ignorance of the signs of depression, also the stigma of mental illness, and also the culture of secrecy. And so that all kept us from recognizing any hints of that something wasn't quite right. When he came home from a leave, from the Army, he visited my husband and I. We were living in Connecticut, and my mild-mannered brother was very frenzied, and he ended up in a shouting match with a long-distance operator who was trying to help him place a call. He also spent time out at with the family in Minnesota, at which time he got into ranted at someone who greeted him on his way out of church. But still, I, was busy with my life. We then had 3 children, and I put it out of my mind. I never thought about my twin having any issues. He had by then gone to Minneapolis, gotten a job, married, and had a daughter. And I thought everything was fine. It wasn't until we were 45 years old and we went back to visit my mother. By then my father had died. To visit my mother for a holiday visit. And at that time, my brother was having a manic episode, which over several days accelerated into hallucinations and a psychotic breakdown. He terrified us. It was a traumatic event, and I ended up calling the police, who came and dragged him out of the condominium, down the hallways and into the cruiser, and took him to the local hospital. It was then that we realized he had a severe mental illness, which was later diagnosed as bipolar disorder. Even so, my mother had been a participant and witness of all of this. She never accepted the fact that he had a mental illness. My twin and I had seen little of each other since he dropped out of college and I had gotten married and moved away. But his breakdown pulled me back into his life, and it landed me. He landed in a psychiatric ward, and I landed in a psychotherapist's office. As children, we had enjoyed our closeness of our tight bonds, but psychologists worry about the close relationship between twins, the intense bonding that occurs, because when the time comes for twins to individuate, to separate from each other, they run the risk of incorporating their twin inside their own self boundary. Their twin becomes part of their self, their sense of self. And this, in our case, was exacerbated by the fact that we had grown up in such isolation that we had very little exposure to other people other than church and Sunday school for our first years. When my mother told the story about when we were young and my brother was refused to take his cough syrup, I opened my mouth and took it for him, thinking it would make him well. At the time, I thought it was a cute little story. I did not realize what the ramifications of that story might be. I also didn't think it was unusual as an adult that I sensed his presence the instant he walked into a room, no matter where in that room he came in, and that I could read his body language from across the room, and that I felt his emotions as if they were my own. My therapist helped me open up an ocean of grief and pain and guilt and sorrow I had carried with me about my twin. What had happened to my brother that we didn't see? Was there something we could have done differently if we had known? I allow the reader to eavesdrop on some of my therapy sessions as I struggle through my pain, including an earth-shattering moment when my therapist says, Marilyn, being a twin was a devastating experience for you. After 3.5 years, my therapist and I felt I was ready to do the work, continue the work on my own. But we had not been able to break through the wall I had built between my mother and me, to protect myself from her criticism, as I longed for her love and approval. So the last main theme I'm going to talk about is my subsequent quest for independence. Many of us know what it's like to be conflicted to feeling obligated to your family while wanting at the same time to live your own life. In my case, again, accentuated by the tight bonds with my twin, my sense of responsibility for his well-being, and my feeling I was taking something away from him whenever I did accomplish something or to separate from him. It was my entangle with him made it even more difficult. If indeed he was a part of me, then how could I be a whole person if I separated from him? The struggle was made more difficult when he began to alienate the people around him and as his mental health deteriorated. He was hospitalized 7 more times before his death at age 67 of cancer. And each time he had an episode of mania and became psychotic, he raged at me. He accused me of, when I called the police, he had been labeled. And behavior that would be considered normal for anyone else would land him in a psychiatric ward. This was very painful, but I realized that once he got back on his medications, that our bonds were still intact. The challenge to free myself from my mother's control took more than a decade after my therapy ended, because I didn't have the strength and the courage to confront her. The question could be asked, why did it take me so long to confront my mother? Well, it's excruciatingly painful to come to grips with the reality that your mother values and loves your twin more than she values you. During the decades I fought to gain my emotional freedom, I learned to accept the truth that all of us are imperfect people, that we are profoundly human. In 1998, Wally Lamb published a novel, I Know This Much Is True, 900-page story about identical twins, one who suffers from a severe mental illness. The book had a profound impact on me as it was published 12 years after I had called the police for my brother. One of his description of the challenge of separating from a twin, I particularly identified with, and I quote excerpts from that paragraph. A talent for survival comes at an enormous cost when you're the sane brother of a schizophrenic identical twin. The tricky thing about saving yourself is the blood it leaves on your hands. And if you're into both survival of the fittest and being your brother's keeper, then say so long to sleep and hello to the middle of the night. Take it from a godless insomniac. Take it from the uncrazy twin, the guy who beat the biochemical rap. So I'll conclude by assuring you that while my book takes you through some painful valleys, it also brings you to some mountaintops. A reviewer for Kirkus Review writes, and I quote, although the memoir can be heartbreakingly sad, it builds to a stirring moment of understanding when the author fully recognized her brother's determination in the face of what was later diagnosed as bipolar disorder. Overall, the sharply conceived book shines a light on the challenges of twinship and offers a deeply personal account of a family coping with mental illness. So now we can take your questions, if I can figure out how to see them.
Feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself or type in the chat. Marilyn, if I see them come through in the chat, I will alert you, but okay. No one has typed any so far.
I see Tom Johnson has a question. If he unmutes himself, he could ask his question.
Do you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, Tom. Oops, Tom, you're muted again. You're muted again. Tom, can you unmute yourself? You're still muted. Does someone else have a question while Tom is trying to
There's
figure
a
out how to...
question. There's a question that came in the chat, Marilyn, from
Okay.
Sally. Have you joined any groups about twins to share experiences?
No, I haven't. It would be fun to do so, but I haven't found a group. If somebody knows of some groups, I'd be happy to get in touch with them. Now, Tom, can you hear us now?
Well, I hear you fine, but I don't
Now
know that you can.
we can hear you now. Now we can hear you.
Well, I grew up in a small town as well, and I now have a son with schizophrenia. It was a real learning experience for me over those years, and it's something that we never expect to have happen in our life. I really enjoyed the perspective that you brought to this tonight about not only the illness, which I've often heard of, the biological illness, which I believe there's certainly that, but there's also the social part of that illness, which makes it very difficult for people to function in their communities, knowing that so much has changed for them from what they might have hoped that they would have anticipated in their life. But I really appreciated that perspective of the twins and the perspective of the small town, because when I grew up in a small town, it was actually pretty close to one of the small towns I lived in was Kirkhoven, near Kirkhoven. And I'm actually probably your second cousin. My brother, Rick, I think is on your Facebook, and he told me about this program, about that you had written a book. And knowing that I've dealt with schizophrenia in my family. So it was really, really good to hear you this evening. And I kind of remember you, but I was probably a little bit younger than you. I think I was in second grade when you and your brother were probably around juniors or seniors. And so I remember some from back then. But anyhow, I really appreciate the thought,
well, thank you.
The feelings that you put into the book, because it's both dealing with mental illness is both the thinking part and understanding, but it's also a lot of feeling about it too, because we have to bring our emotions to the illness as well as our thinking. Thank you much.
Thank you, Tom. And it's nice to see my second cousin, whom I haven't seen since I was a child.
Thank you. Nini, did you have a question? You had unmuted earlier.
I just wanted to say that it is such a great book, and I read it avidly, so I recommend it for anyone else. And Marilyn, great job. And some of the difficulties with your mom, I feel many of us are mothers, and how you can get into a bit of a trap trying to protect one that doesn't seem competitive with the others. I mean, and I see how your mom made this at your expense, but you're the strong one. So congratulations.
Well, thank you. And I think you bring up a good point, which is, when I finished reading this book, I had a lot of compassion for my mother, because I have 3 children, and I'm sure that if one, that it's an easy trap to fall into. And in the case of twins, I think it's really important to see each one as an individual. Now, I've read that it's probably not a good idea to separate twins that are really close to each other when they start school, because they're so closely tied to each other. But I think each twin or each child has to be really valued for their unique abilities and their unique talents, and to try not to compare them at all. In our case, we were dressed in matching clothes. We were called the twins the whole time when we were younger anyway. And we, in the one-room school, we were always very close to each other. So the comparisons for both of us, and at that time, I thought, you know, it was most detrimental for my brother, not realizing it also had an impact on me. So I think treating each child as an individual. And Nini, also I think that, you know, I worry about how many of the characteristics have I duplicated when in the raising of my own children? How much have I passed on instead of
Sorry.
that's all right. Your granddaughter is very funny. How much have I passed on to my own children? And I think, you know, it's easy to overcompensate, but also I think that we're more aware of things now. When my parents had twins, they knew none of these risks, none of the things to watch out for. So are there other questions?
Terry Weaver sorry, Rachel. Terry Weaver had raised his hand. So Terry, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, a couple of things, Marilyn. Did you get into the medications that your brother might have used, or how they affected?
Yeah. He was put on which is it, that fluoride is that? Well, no, what is the medication they give most? Yes. Yes, and he refused to take it because it was associated with manic depressives, although it seemed to be pretty effective. So that left them to have to kind of try many different drugs. And I knew at the time what they were, but by the time he had reached the end of his life, they were having trouble finding drugs that were very effective. And so he, you know, it was hard for him, and each of those medications has side effects, and so it's hard to take them. So he would go off. That would start him in his cycle. He would go off the medications, and then he would become manic, and then he felt great until he until he became psychotic and had a breakdown and landed in a psychiatric ward. And then between those were followed by major depressions. So it was very difficult for him.
Yeah, when they are hypomanic and they really feel terrific, like Superman and all, you know, I've been there myself, and it's great for me, but my family and others around me don't think it's so great. But there's a book that you may well have read by a K. Jameson.
Yes.
A really terrific book if you're interested in bipolar, particularly.
Yes, I've read that. It's an excellent book. Yes. And Rachel, I think you had a question. Thank you, Terry.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to ask a little bit about how your book has been received within your family, because you're obviously talking about stuff that cuts close to the bone for a lot of people close to you. And I was wondering how that has gone.
You know, this is a big worry for me because I have a whole batch of cousins, maybe I think 23 first cousins, and many of them still live out near Kirkhoven in the area where I grew up. I have a sister, you know, and then my younger brother, I have a brother 10 years younger. And I wrote about everybody's names. I used everybody's names, and I got in touch with all the people who had more than just a walk-on part to see if it was okay to, if they wanted me to change their name. My sister was very worried about how she was going to appear in the book. And I tried to assure her that she was always a wonderful sister to me. She didn't stop worrying until she had read the book. And then she read it like 3 times because she found it to be her life story in many ways as well. My younger brother farms a farm now. He stepped into the role my twin was supposed to fill, and he became the son who took over the farm. He's a typical stoical Scandinavian Swede, and he doesn't say much, but he did say, yeah, it was a page turner. He didn't, you know, so I guess that's his version of a high compliment. My cousins came. I went out to Minnesota for a book reading in the end of June, And a whole bunch of my cousins that live out there showed up, and classmates and friends, and they were wonderful. They were so excited about the book and very happy for me. So I've been very pleasantly pleased about the reaction. Another one that I worried a lot about was my brother's daughter. I didn't get to know her until really my brother's death, because he had kind of kept her from us, and we hadn't been around that much. And during that 5-day process, we became very close. And so I went down, she works in Rochester. I went down to talk to her about my book several times. And she had one great comment, which she doesn't remember making. But I said, you know, some people would worry about this book. And she said, well, then they should write their own book. Yes, it was something I worried about. I also think that writing openly about our family and all the impact of Marvin's mental illness kind of opened up the possibility of being more open about mental illness in your family. And during that book signing in Kirkhoven, a number of people came up to me and said, you know, I have a child, I have a sibling, I have a friend who has mental illness. And so it kind of opened up the conversation. And to that extent, I think it's done a good thing, at least for some people.
Marilyn, there's another question in the chat. How was the fact that you were different sexes influence your understanding of your situation?
That's kind of hard to answer. I think, people who are twins with same-sex twins probably have even more strong issues. His issue of being a boy made him, put him into that favored position of the firstborn son. So that actually had more effect, I think, not the fact that he was a twin as much as that he was the favored son who was to take over the farm. So I think that had more of an impact on me. It put us each into a role. It put my dad into a role of wanting that son expectations, and put my mother into a role of wanting to make him into the son that my father expected him to be. So I'm not sure how to quite answer the question about boy and girl other than that. But thank you for the question.
Anyone else? There isn't anything else in the chat, but feel free to unmute if you'd like to ask Marilyn another question.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, it's Julie. As you know, I enjoyed reading your book very much. And I was just thinking, I know you wrote it over quite a long period of time, and it's been out for a while, and people have told you their impressions, as have I. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts since you published it of things that you have thought differently, or do you have any different thoughts from when you finished the book about what you wrote in the book?
Not really. I mean, a book is never finished. They say you never really finish a book, you just abandon it at some point because it's never totally done. And I'm sure if I went back and started to reread it, I'd say, oh man, I could have said this differently or better. I could have used different language here. I haven't actually done that, so I'm not sure how I would feel. But as far as the content, I think it was almost as if when I finished writing this book, that I had finished something I had finished. I'm not talking about the book itself. I'm talking about the process of taking my life apart and looking at it and then putting all the pieces back together again. And in order to write this book, I had to do that. It was a real, what would I say? I had to think deeply about many things instead of superficially. And by the end of the book, I had come to be a tremendous compassion for all of us, for my poor mother who really wanted to make my twin into the son my dad wanted, for my dad who was heartbroken. My great grandfather handed the farm down to his son, my grandfather, the firstborn son, my grandfather down to my father, who was the firstborn son. And then my father was going to hand it down to his son, the firstborn son. It was so hugely important to him, and drove his expectations. And my twin, I felt great compassion for him for having to deal with mental illness and the stigma, and how hard he struggled and fought against that stigma by refusing to acknowledge he had the illness. So it finished a lot of things for me. I ended up feeling great sympathy for everyone I wrote about. So it finished kind of, it gave me a sense of peace that I had dealt with all these issues as best as I could in the book.
Marilyn, it's Terry here again.
Yes.
Did your brother spend much time sort of mildly hypomanic, where he really felt terrific about himself, and maybe perhaps upset with any therapist or what have you who might have given him medication to try to dampen that feeling of I forgot the word I'm looking for, but
Probably elation or something.
elation. Yeah, that was a good word. It's easy to get upset with people who try to dampen that feeling of elation down quite a bit.
You know, I didn't see my brother very often because we lived on the East Coast and he lived in Minneapolis. And so I tended to see him. I visited him in the psychiatric ward, I think 3 times when we went to Minneapolis. What I learned was that when he knew we were coming to visit family, he would go off his medications. And I tried to understand why that would be. And I think it was because it was his way of trying to maybe prove that he didn't need them, or to get the feel-good feeling of mania. And so by the time we'd get there, he would be in the psychiatric ward. And so what happened, I stopped telling him we were coming. I'd only tell him a few days before we came. And then we would meet him in a restaurant. My husband and I would meet him for lunch or something. And then he was fine. You know, I didn't see signs of manic behavior. So I didn't get to see that middle point that you're talking about, where there's some, where he felt elated, except when we were there for his breakdown. Before he started having hallucinations, he started to talk very loudly. He dominated the conversation. We'd sit down to eat at the table and he'd just take over the conversation, and he'd pound the table and he'd argue with everybody. And our children were frightened. They were really frightened because he became belligerent, and it was a brother that was foreign to me. So he was feeling fine, but everybody around him was not. So I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but.
It sounds very familiar, unfortunately.
Anyone else?
I see Judy Miller. I see Judy.
I got a question, Marilyn.
Okay.
When you talk, and I want to keep seeing people that I miss and care about. Marilyn, what questions would you hope we would ask? Are there any that you would like us to ask that would?
Not really. One question that nobody's asked, a lot of people ask, is how did I end up writing a book that was published just a few months before I turned 80, my first book? That's been a pretty common, well, I think people are a little afraid to ask it because, age discrimination and all of that. But frankly, I'm happy I'm here. My brother isn't, so I'm going to be 80, but I'm alive. I'm here. I'm happy to be 80. And it took that long because it took 70 years to live the life. And then it took another decade to take some writing classes and to figure out how to write and to write the book and to get an agent, to get a publisher. And so that's why it took 80 years for me to actually publish the book. It took me until I was 80. It didn't take me 80 years. But it took me until I was 80 to publish the book.
Tom, I think you need to unmute if you'd like to. I think you're saying something.
I know. I was wondering what Marvin's life was like when he was relatively stable with his condition, when he was not in a manic high or a depressive low. Was he able to function at a level that allowed him to work and,
Yes.
be a family member, decent
Yes.
family member?
Yes, he when he came out of the army, he told dad and mother that he was going to work on the farm for 1 year, and then he was going to Minneapolis to take go to electronics school. I think it was called Minneapolis School of Electronics or something, which he did, and he did well. And then he got a job with Control Data, and he worked with them all the way up until they merged a couple of divisions and they laid off a whole bunch of people. And by then his daughter was about 10 years old, I believe. And then he had a very warm relationship with his daughter, and his wife, Sharon, kind of protected his daughter from his illness. And then he was on unemployment for a while. He couldn't get another job in electronics. And so he got a part-time job at Cub Foods, and he worked for them part-time. And his wife, Sharon, said that that was really all he could handle at that time. His mental health had deteriorated, but he worked right up until the day he drove himself to the hospital and died a week later of cancer. He was that determined. That job meant everything to him. And one of the stunning things that happened was at his funeral, his manager and two of the workers at Cub Food came to his funeral. And the manager made a point of telling us, he said Marvin was the best worker he had ever had. So yes, he was very functional, and he wanted to work more hours, but he managed to work, I think, pretty much half time those last years.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I just want to thank Marilyn for sharing her work with us tonight, and for all of you for attending. And I did put in the chat a link to the bookstore if you'd like to order a copy of the book. And thank you all again. Thank you, Marilyn, so much. It was wonderful to have you. I wish it could have been in person, but thanks to everyone for joining us virtually tonight. And we hope to see you another time soon here at the Lenox Library. So I'm going to
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Katie, for hosting this event. And thank you all for coming and participating.
Thank you so much, Marilyn.
Thank you.
Very interesting, Marilyn.
Thank you. Thank you.